Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this greatest webinar on sort of retirement living, supported living, the implications of retirement supported living. And my name's Steve Quartermain. I'm formerly Chief Planner, but probably a good example of why we need to have this session, because of course someone emailed me and said, was this particular topic of interest to me now that I was retired? And of course, here I am actually working probably just as hard as I was before March last year when I was Chief Planner. And I refer to it as I stepped down from that role, and I'm still doing lots of different things. And I'm a good example of here I am working for Kratos and Town Legal and HGH and the like, and have portfolio of activities. It's a civil servant thing, and I suppose for me the reason I was keen to do this is the challenge of the planning system dealing with people like me who retire and need to carry on working, and the way in which the planning system responds to how these people live is a challenge which I think we all need to address. The Office of National Statistics and Age UK, if you look at their website, they talk about there's like 12 million people over 65 at the moment. And a good proportion of those, 1.2 million of those people are still working like me. And 50% of those people that are working say they do so because they're not ready to stop work yet. And that's me. I think that if you look forward, the way in which the projections go, that by another 50 years, 18% of the population will be over 65. No, I think that's now, 18% is now. By 50 years' time, it could be 26%. This has implications for social health and the planning system. And I think today we've brought together a panel to discuss that. How does the planning system respond to this? The NPPF in paragraph 61 talks about local planning authorities bringing together, a mixed tenure, mixed use, and planning for the future. But is that single paragraph enough? Is it actually leading to the outcomes that we think that we should expect? We have today an excellent panel of people to explore this and think about what we should be done. It includes, reading from the top, Jeremy Porteous, Chief Executive of Housing at Lynn, formerly at the Department of Health, where he led the National Programme for Housing. Anne-Marie Nicholson, partner at PRP, who is a leading specialist in the field of design for older people. Mark Curry, previously at Grosvenor, now at Elsian Residences, who has first-hand experience of trying to deliver developments that meet this requirement. And last but by no means least, Andy von Bratsky, Head of Architecture at the MHCLG. So the question is going to be, what's going on? Are we thinking about this in the right way? And should the government be doing more? And that's always a question, isn't it? Hopefully that today we will try and explore that as part of our discussion. The way we want to run it is have some input from each of the panelists, and then a bit of discussion. There is a Q&A option, and I will be trying to pick up some of the Q&As as you ask them for the last 20 minutes. So do use the Q&A, please, and I will try and pick that up as part of the later discussion. So with that all said, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. I'm going to start by asking Jeremy to sort of give us a bit of a view from his perspective. So Jeremy, do you want to start?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for that introduction. For those who don't know me, as Steve said, I'm the Chief Executive of the Housing Learning Improvement Network, and formerly was the change agent in the Department of Health responsible for housing. If you haven't come across the Housing Learn, we have a dedicated website that looks at everything around housing for an ageing population, including an exclusive page which looks at planning. So at your leisure, please do sort of browse after you've had your breakfast session this morning. So Steve sort of introduced the session session by sort of talking about some of the current trends. And it's absolutely true. We have an increasing older population, but also what has struck us, I think, in the Housing Lynn over the last 6 months is we've got a significant number of people, older people, living alone. And that isolation and loneliness in many cases has also been exacerbated by COVID. And coupled with that, we've seen an increasing number of people living with long-term limiting illnesses and or disabilities. So the way we think and plan about our housing for an ageing population needs to really think about the breadth of types of lifestyles and housing needs, and possibly also the care needs that we need to think about going forward. And those care needs can be anything like supporting people with dementia, people who've got chronic heart diseases and the like. So again, we need to think about the sort of planning in the round, both in terms of the homes we build, but also the types of communities that we all want to live in. The evidence for this is significant, and Steve alluded to some of the sort of growth aspects, and the demand for retirement living and supported living has increased and is increasing. So for planners and those who are developers, want to finance and commission and develop and build out, there is a real appetite for taking this forward. And 1 in 4 people over 65, well, 1 in 4 of us will be over 65 by 2037. But the statistics that always stands out in my mind is that by 2050, 50% of the population will be over 50. So in preparing for later living, we need to think about those people who are younger old, and also those people who are approaching retirement, to think about what their mood and motivations will be for wanting to right size, downsize in later life. But at the same time, our existing stock has some real challenges, and only 7% of them meet basic accessibility requirements at the present, and that's according to the English Housing Survey. And Have and Take celebrated the Accessible Homes Week recently, and that showed that almost a quarter of disabled households do not have a home which meets their access needs. And that health link and the care bit I mentioned a short while ago, the Building Research Establishment have shown that by 2041, if we don't get appropriate housing in place, it could cost our economy, and particularly our NHS, up to £20 billion. So again, there's a health dividend if we can plan for our communities and our homes, for both for later living and retirement housing, but also supported living. And in terms of supported living, I saw really referring to how homes for people with disabilities, with a learning disability or autism. And some work that the Housing Lynn did with MENCAP a couple of years ago showed that there was actually a significant shortfall of that type of accommodation by up to 30,000 units of supported housing over the next 10 years. So again, how we plan that into the system when our planning sort of regulations and our planning laws are very much focused on mainstream housing really touches an issue about whether our current NPPF and the planning policy white paper that's out here at the moment really is addressing those needs. You mentioned sort of the work of the local government earlier, Steve. I mean, I think they have produced a report that demonstrates from an ageing perspective, we have even more of a shortfall of this type of accommodation. And they wrote a report on housing our ageing population a few years back, which called for a residential revolution, when it says that it needs an estimated 400,000 units of housing for older people by 2030. We're currently building about 5,000 to 6,000. And it's caught between those that are C2, C3, and thinking about sui generis and thinking about whether we've got the right planning framework to help grow this market and meet that demand for that type of accommodation. And we'll hear a bit more, I'm sure, from Anne-Marie, Mark and Andy about some of that. But the LGA called for local authorities to have a clearer vision about their housing for older people, and then particularly making sure that they were planning at an early stage and with their planning authority responsibilities, thinking about what the type of housing for older people will look like. So you touched on the NPPF. He was right. The paragraph 61 does reflect issues around ageing and disability, and the planning white paper, which comes to the consultation, which ends at the moment, is disappointingly silent for me on issues around ageing. It's really good on thinking around systems and process and how we can sort of look at using the planning system to generate building. But in terms of providing some specific guidance and some framework for housing for older people, I think, you know, the role of local authorities will be very critical in making sure that they have really good quality predictive demand measurement tools to actually help them identify the plans that they need. And our organisations like ARCO, the trade body for retirement villages, have even called for, perhaps there's a call for a new use class order, which is a hybrid C2 classification or the like, to look at where extra care, assisted living, the retirement living housing fits in. But alongside this, just before I finish, there are a couple of other things. One is that currently the government is also consulting on the accessibility standards. It's no point us planning and building new homes if they aren't future-proof for age-friendly living in later life. So again, we're very much in favour of having the highest accessibility standards and design quality. And these will be lessons that we'll learn from things like the Home of 2030 competition that I'm sure Andy will touch on. And again, importantly, Homes England and the GLA have recently announced their affordable housing programme. So where there is money in the system to build some public sector housing, at least 10% of that has to be for retirement living and for supported living. So again, there's some encouraging news about generating the levers to look at maximising demand growth to meet that demand. And there's also other investor appetite, equity and debt finance, looking at different models of extra care, or looking at different models of retirement living, increasingly co-living and co-housing for older people, and indeed also private rented. So again, the market is starting to change as well, from very much an affordable to a mixed market, mixed tenure, and thinking really more about some of that outright ownership and rental as well. So again, it's exciting times on one level, and we need to make sure that we also communicate that to older people themselves to enable them to make those informed decisions. Because I just want to leave you with a couple of little things, because actually if we get this right, the outcomes are really both the public purse, but also the quality of life that older and disabled people can live in later life. And some evidence that's been done by another authority called Southampton City Council shows if we get the right housing in the right place, it has a significant NHS dividend in freeing up savings for health to fund better quality of life and support for those who most need it in local communities. So again, planning is a critical part of this jigsaw of health, housing, and I think social care. So I hope that gives a really useful introductory flavour to this morning's breakfast session. Thank you, Steve.
Jeremy, thank you. An excellent start, an excellent oversight, and also shining a light on the fact that it's complex. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't start to try and unpick it and try and understand it. I understand that you have some slides that you will make available subsequently to people to look at, so we can pick that up if people want to see some of the data that Jeremy's been referring to. We will be making that available as part of the recording.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To keep the discussion going, perhaps I can come to Anne-Marie, I've noticed some questions coming in already, and we'll be picking up some of those later, particularly on the youth class questions and the implications on the Rectory Home decisions, although I suspect the answer to that one will be it's still being assessed. But Anne-Marie, can I come to you and get you to add your bit to the discussion?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. We have quite a unique position as architects specialising in the later living sector, and we're able to see influences and trends some years before they become built into our communities. But it is our clients that react to these future opportunities and take the lead in realising the housing and care products that the older population demand. I had a think about what a glance into the future would look like, and it would certainly involve options for how we will house and care for our ageing society, particularly in the context of the recent pandemic. I'm really pleased that there's a real spotlight on that now. The future complexities created by the planning class use or social and healthcare policies will have been overcome or aligned. That's my future wish, and that will maximise the independent and intergenerational living we all aspire to. I hope we'll all share the belief that older people are not a single group of like-minded or culturally similar people, and we'll realise the huge social and health benefits to our communities of keeping families, friendships and connections together in a truly intergenerational setting. Our town centres, parks and streets will be designed to be universally accessible, and leisure services will be aimed at all demographics to create inclusivity and choice. And there'll be a range of housing and care options to enable older people to make decisions that would suit their current but changing future needs. We'll be able to free our thinking and start to imagine how we might live better, a little bit like we've been doing over the last 6 months. Perhaps a lot of you have been doing that, using our time differently, broadening our minds, helping others, considering our future potential fiscal limitations. So we were really pleased just last year in June that the NPPF was bolstered with a new planning practice guidance that specifically required local authorities to consider both how to support older people in their own homes and the provision of specialist accommodation. That was a real positive. And it also said that supporting independent living can help reduce the costs to health and social services. And as Jeremy's just said, he's actually proved that with a piece of work in Southampton. We're very aware of some excellent local authorities who may or may not have policies in place. And I think this is the point. It doesn't take a policy to mean a local authority can actually make a difference. It really helps, and we welcome that. But Birmingham, Leicester, Peterborough, Ashford, RBKC, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, Barnet, Woking, Surrey, Manchester, Horsham have all developed more than one. They understand the affordable and they understand the private sector as well. Sometimes local authorities make political decisions about whether or not housing for older people can be, part of their housing policy going forward. And that's a real shame, because seeing it in the round is what we're all hoping local authorities will do. Moving on to other more specifics, I think in terms of tenure, for some years the private sector was very slow to respond to the need for high quality and aspirational housing. There was always a good and socially responsible focus on affordable housing, but very little for the homeowner. A high percentage of older people are homeowners, and even before the market has met the pent-up demand for this group, we're seeing an emerging market for private rental or a blend of rental and ownership products. I remember well being in a conference where it was put to the floor, what demographic who wants to get off the property ladder? And I said, well, it's actually the older population. They're the only people who would consider getting off the ladder. And that factor hasn't been recognised in mainstream housing. Flexibility in tenure provides more choice for those looking for a solution in a crisis, considering a lifestyle change, or who can't manage the sale and purchase of two properties at the same time. So the market is wider when a choice of tenures is available, and doesn't rely necessarily on sales figures and how quickly you can sell a unit. Little data exists to show how this works, unfortunately, but certainly a financial model that allows a slower return than that of a traditional developer is key to unlocking choice. And then creating choices for older people to live at the heart of the community in an urban setting was first put forward by the Happy Report in 2009. It's proved incredibly difficult to implement, but there's now recognition starting to emerge from planners and developers, luckily both in tandem, that older people don't just benefit from the location, but actually contribute to it and improve it. Facilities, shops and services which are close by are used regularly. There's a vibrancy and economic stability, eyes on the street, and new businesses that can thrive. And communities are held together by intergenerational interaction and active participants. So the other 2 points I wanted to mention were well-being and active living, sustainability, and our response to post-COVID design. And I think it's all about staying safe, happy, and together, rather than creating a sort of clinically safe place. We need to recognise that design and the way these buildings or the way society works is to keep everybody happy and together, and rather not isolated. And my one tip would be try to get as much natural light and ventilation and private amenity space and gardens and balconies as you can. They're no longer a luxury, they are an absolute must for everybody to live a happy and safe life. So that's me.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and I think that the COVID perspective is an interesting one about really throwing a spotlight on how people live and what they expect from their living accommodation. I think the really interesting point there about do you need a policy and do you need government to tell you what to do in order to take this forward? And that is something which I wanted to come to in our discussion about sort of a new perspective in dealing with some of these issues. There is always a risk that people expect to be told what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. And there is a bit about those authorities who are rising to this challenge are already doing some really good stuff, and there may be some things that we can learn from that. And again, the issue about use class orders, is that just the answer? And I think we'll come to that when we talk to Andy from MHCLG. But I want to, before we get to Andy, come to another sort of practitioner and talk to Mark. Mark previously at Grosvenor and now at Elsian. And Mark, I'll be interested to get your views on what's actually happening and perhaps your experience of trying to deliver in this current market.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Steve, for the introduction. And yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to address 2 points. One, to explain a little bit about what we do, and then secondly, some thoughts around how the planning system can help deliver more of this housing. So firstly, about Elysian. Elysian Residences, we're a UK-based company that's solely focused on operating, developing and owning homes for older people in the south east of England. We currently have one retirement village in operation, which is in the Lansby in Stanmore, which sits right next to the tube station. I think Anne-Marie spoke about central locations, and this is one of them. And we have several other developments in various stages of the development process, including many of in the planning system. In total, we have circa 500 homes that we're pursuing at this point in time. For many of you will be familiar about what we do in the later living C2 extra care, but for those of you less so, I think it's worth just explaining what we do. We provide generously sized apartments for sale on a long lease, the majority of which are 2 beds, but some are 1 and 3 beds, responding to different wants of our homeowners. They look and feel like normal apartments, but with a number of features that allow older people to get maximum use of their home and also allows them to be adapted over time. And an exceptional amount of thought goes into this. Usually, the buildings are around 100 apartments in total. Of this building, about 10 to 15 of the development space is given over to share spaces. And I'll focus on this because it's very important that I think the audience understands it. These will include a gym, a library space, a restaurant and bar, a multi-purpose room, potentially a card room. That's proven quite popular with some of our homeowners at the moment. Treatment room where doctors and other appointments can be held. A care office from which 24-hour trained care staff are based. Care that is tailored to meet the specific wants and needs of the homeowners. These shared spaces and how the retirement village is run really drives the benefit of what we do, but it does come at a substantial cost compared to traditional residential, where such space will either not be developed, which saves the developer costs, or turned into apartments for sale, which would realise value. Elysian's focus and passion is about supporting our homeowners to live as independently as possible and allowing them to have a hassle-free life. This may mean helping them with exercising regularly through classes and other activities, helping them with daily activities such as registering for online shopping, assisting them with more personal care activities, or throwing them a birthday party. And I want to emphasise this last point, or something very simple like merely stopping to have a chat with a homeowner, who's slightly more reticent to join in the community life, to help respond to fears of isolation and loneliness. The care we provide is through the CQC. We would be a registered domiciliary care company that's run by ourselves, Elysian, based at the retirement village, and most care will be provided in the apartment to ensure it's done discreetly. This care can flex over time as the homeowner's needs change, with a focus always on providing as little support as is needed, hence emphasising this want and need to live independently. To help us get up to speed on how to operate in a first-class manner and instill a culture of customer service, we partner with a leading operator, US operator 180 Leisure Care. They help us develop our operational setup and processes, and I guess most importantly, share lessons learned about designing these retirement villages. Lessons that one can only learn with time and experience. They've been in operation for 40 years and they house around 6,500 residents across the US, India and Mexico. Whilst we're flexible, our ideal location is within an existing towns, close to transport and amenities. Again, I think echoing what Anne-Marie said earlier. I could go on for hours about what we do, but Steve, I know time is short, so I won't do that. Turning to planning, I'd like to just set out the benefits of what we do, and this has been touched upon by both Jeremy and Anne-Marie. Outside of the very important fact we provide homes that people want to move into, the 2 main benefits which happen to address national priorities are: it frees up underutilised family housing, as through providing high quality, generously sized apartments with the first class service and amenities, such as the restaurant, people are willing to leave their home, which is often a large family house, but with only 1 or 2 people living in it. This is an efficient use of land. Secondly, and I think Jeremy's, has spoken about it, and we can maybe debate it further, I think it has been proven to reduce the burden on the NHS. Little things, there are less trips and slips because of the thoughtful design in the buildings. There are less visits to GPs and A&E, as on-site staff can intercept times that homeowners may be seeking reassurance rather than actually in need of urgent medical care. It helps avoid loneliness, which I think has been time and time again proven to have massive health benefits. And it promotes a focus on wellness, making access to exercise and healthier food much easier. The list goes on, but I think it speaks for itself. However, despite these benefits, in my opinion, there is a lack of support in the planning system. As already mentioned today, the white paper mentions housing for older people, not at all, whereas it mentions, homes for younger people 5 times. And, I just want to emphasize that they're not mutually exclusive. You can promote new homes at the same time as one promotes more appropriate forms of housing for older people, particularly as the population ages. There's a lack of national policy promoting specialist housing for older people, despite their clear benefits. And sort of on the ground, I guess this permeates to local planning policy too. In recent years, it's in fact got harder to secure sites and secure planning, as there's been a move to treating C2 extra care as the same as traditional C3 residential and requiring it to provide affordable housing. As stated earlier, by me, it's hard for us to compete with this traditional residential given the economics are very different, particularly regarding the need to provide these shared spaces that deliver the benefits I've spoken about earlier. Tied to this skepticism at a local authority, I think that there's a view sometimes by politicians and officers that, myself and our peers are just trying to circumvent affordable housing without recognising the benefits. And I don't think this skepticism is helped by the fact that, there are some, developers that are much more opportunists. One can clearly see these opportunists often through a lack of detailed design around how it will be operated and suitable for older people, lack of shared spaces, lack of a willingness to commit towards certain controls in the Section 106 agreement, and a lack of understanding and track record around the operations. So these type of parties that promote development, and we may come on to one when we speak about the Rectory Home case later, don't help our position. So what can be done? I think we need to work together as a group of professionals working in this space to better explain what we do, why we do it, and the benefit it brings, to ensure the benefits are recognised. This could well translate into targets for housing for older people. Of the 337,000 homes per annum being targeted, how many are targeted for older people? Help local authorities better identify the legitimate operators from those opportunist developers. Policy that recognises the benefit of this form of housing, come at a cost, and therefore should be treated differently from traditional residential. It's being done for build to rent. Why can't it be done for housing for older people? Potentially proper site allocations for C2 extra care. Time and time again, I see local authorities, in my opinion, being slightly lazy and allocating master plans to house an element of C2 extra care when it's sorely lacking in thought and focus on how that will sit within part of a master wider plan. I hope it comes across. I'm massively passionate about what we do. I do believe there are material benefits. And, I think the planning system has a role to play in it, and, it really can help us deliver more of this housing. Thank you for your time.
Well, that's a fascinating insight, and it's interesting that one of the things I'm keen to do in this session is to sort of not just talk about the status as it is, if you like, but to really challenge about what we need to do to have a step change in the way in which we view this issue. One of the things I want to come on, and you touched on it there, is a little bit about why people would be inclined to move, and what their incentive is. Why would somebody sort of leave their house, and which is very often seen as their inheritance. So to sort of forewarn the panel, I do want to talk a little bit about money and the finances. What are the incentives to do this? I'm also keen to think about what we might need to do new. As I said, I recognise that this has been an interesting discussion if we just talk about what's been happening, but I do want to try and see this discussion as perhaps setting an agenda for what needs to happen, which leads me neatly to the last of the panelists, Andy von Bransky from MHCLG, head of architecture. He used to work in the same team as my good self when I was there. And I know that he's been doing some work on housing for an aging population. And Andy, I wonder whether you might like to give us an update as to some of the current thinking and on why you've been doing some of the work you've been doing.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a shame I can't see faces. It's, we're, I suppose, all used to this by now, but there is an advantage in being face-to-face. Maybe that'll happen sometime soon. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak about this particular issue. Really good to be sitting virtually with both Anne-Marie and Steve, both of whom I used to work closely with in different lives. My role at the moment is quite wide-ranging. I advise on design-related matters primarily across the department, but in particular in the Planning Directorate, and of course closely at the moment involved in planning reform aspects, and I'll come on to that because I think it's relevant here to the discussion. I have to say Housing for Older People is not my specialist policy area in the department, so my comments are much more general. And I'll be interested to sort of take back some of the feedback from this session and go back to policy leads in planning and in other departments. Anyway, a first thing to say is that ministers are conscious that we need to build more homes for older people. They recognise the need to address and support or address the issues arising from an ageing population. And of course, currently, it's particularly important in the context of relieving the pressure on adult social care and the health service. So first of all, to mention that the ministers are particularly interested in how we might address some of those issues. Government's already done some aspects of, or addressed some aspects of this in recent times. Planning we've talked about, and I'll come back to how the planning system, the current planning system actually supports more work in this area. The work on existing homes through the use of Disability Facilities Grant, of course, is ongoing. I think it's been underway for about 30 years now and continues to be an investment. Building regulations and changes to that, which I'd like to sort of just focus on because again, that can help the sector. Encouraging small SMEs and other new players into the market, and we launched the Home of 2030 competition this year, and I'll say a few words about that. And then finally, of course, money and subsidies have been increased on supported housing in the latest AHP settlement. So firstly, at the MPPF, Steve knows far more about this area than I do, having sort of overseen the changes and the strengthening in the MPPF under paragraph 61, but also worth mentioning that planning practice guidance had a very thorough sort of reference back to this particular sector. So a strengthened policy for accessible housing, setting out an expectation that planning policies locally for housing should make use of the government's optional technical standards for accessible housing, as well as addressing the needs locally of older people. Planning practice guidance actually lists out all the various different specialist sector areas. It references to the Happy Report. It really strengthens this particular area. But as Steve will only be too aware, it's all down to how local authorities respond to policy set nationally. And that's the question I suppose many of you will be facing in reality. Part M consultation, of course, launched. It was long in the making and got delayed due to the pandemic, but has now been launched and offers 5 options to change Part M4, the accessibility standards. Actually, one of the options, of course, is to get rid of, or not get rid of, but to make Part M41 not the default option, so by exception only. So the default would be to M42, which of course would help enormously in terms of how accessibility standards within homes can enable more sort of adaptation, I suppose, to the needs of older people. So living areas at entrance level, step-free access, wider doorways, corridors, those sort of issues might make or could potentially make a difference to that. So I'd urge the sector to be looking at that particular consultation and responding. And of course, that ties in a bit with inclusive design, and much more emphasis in government on policy on inclusive design. There's an interesting piece of work going on a disability strategy, which is actually being led by Number 10 or being directed by Number 10, which is actually looking at how inclusive design can support more accessible housing, more accessible built environment effectively. And it's woven into almost everything that we do at the moment. Home 2030 was mentioned by Jeremy, who has been tremendous in helping shape, not just the brief, but also helping shape decisions around how the competition is going. We're in the second stage of that competition. Fundamentally, there's a recognition that we need new typologies. 80% of people, I think, statistically prefer to live in their own home as they age, with healthcare and support delivered to their home. So that's a real issue, I think, for the sector. We need new typologies. There's a shortage of homes in the market that actually address the need for adaptable and flexible living over the lifetime, multi-generational occupancy, changing use from family use to the needs of older people. So we've been working with BEIS, another government department, and the Department of Health to actually devise a competition for Home 2030, and it addresses the industrial grand challenge of an ageing society, which is one of four particular strands of challenge that particular programme is addressing. We expect to be able to name the winner in November and look forward to sort of seeing how the market can respond to different needs. Finally, final point about planning reform. I think this is probably the area that will generate the most discussion in your debate. I have to say we're in the very early stages of planning reform. It might appear that there's an awful lot of policy that sits behind the proposal in the white paper. There isn't. There's a lot of policy work to develop over a period of time. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as somebody said, but four key issues I think is worth reflecting on. The planning reform package is about increasing certainty in the planning system, speed of delivery, quality, really right up there, which is good for me because I spend a lot of time on design issues, and the environmental agenda, which again is a good thing to have one of those four pillars addressing climate change. Much more emphasis on defining local housing need locally. As you know, a lot of concern at the moment by many local authorities about imposed requirements, and that's of course playing out at the moment. So I think given the dialogue that's going on at the moment, it would be really good to have feedback from what the new planning system should do to address the needs of housing for older people. It's not something that has actually been raised specifically, but it should be, of course, and it will need to be coming forward. I think just one final design-related matter, and that's about the design code, which I'm leading work on at the moment. The model code is about good places and how do you create places that are well designed and that people will love into the future. And I think there's some issues around how community buildings, care homes, specialist housing can be seamlessly integrated into development to make places and to enhance place. Anyway, more to do, and a government in listening mode. I think that's a summary, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And I'm going to move into a sort of more general discussion. So those panelists that are brave enough can unmute themselves, because I'm not necessarily going to come to you directly. I'm quite happy for you just to chip in. One of the things I want to talk about, and having said that, I am going to come to you first, Jeremy. It was this issue about a more holistic approach. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, the 15 minutes city centre, that having a more holistic approach. Why are we still thinking about this in terms of almost pepper potting this sort of development within everything else we're planning for? People expect you know, everyone talks about affordable housing, and there's an expectation that houses should be affordable. Why isn't there the same expectation that the planning system should be delivering, as you said, this huge increase in provision that we can see coming down the line? Is there a view? I mean, do we need more policy, or do we just need more practice? Jeremy.
Yeah, good question. And I saw in the chat box around the 15-minute city. I'm a great fan of that, and I actually think it lends itself very neatly to concepts like the healthy living neighbourhood and the broader aspects around that holistic approach, as you said. And I think we need a blend of both innovative practice as well as some incentives to enable people, whether it's regulatory or finance, to enable us to grow more age-friendly communities, as well as looking at specialist housing for older people and people with disabilities as a hub to both have inward movement, but also to be part of an active community where they can lead healthier lifestyles. The other side of it, it has a significant economic benefit, both in terms of people who right-size, downsize, free up family housing, but also where they themselves either still are in active employment in later life, or are employing others to care and support for them. And somewhere like a retirement village or an extra care scheme, whether it's in an urban centre or in a rural community, has a significant footfall, both of people visiting that scheme, but who work there as well. So I think there's a viability, not just in terms of the building itself, but also what its community benefits are, which are often not measured appropriately.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's quite a lot of talk about, and I'm going to start with the existing system, about local planning authorities being good at some of this, but also a call for there being a change in use class, a C2B or C2 whatever, to actually specifically allow councils to presumably allocate land for this particular use. I mean, there's a bit of me that thinks that runs a bit contrary to what we've just been saying about a more holistic approach. But if I go with the flow and say, well, within master planning, you can sort of create areas where you can deliver this. Anne-Marie, Mark, I mean, do you think that that's something that would help you, or is it more ingrained in terms of you still wouldn't be able to compete with the on land prices? I mean, is a change in use class something that you would advocate?
I mean, the devil's always in the detail, isn't it? And but yeah, potentially that's one of the solutions. And the other one I touched upon is just, you know, having harder targets for a specialist form of housing for older people. That could be a similar route. You know, I think the specific use class, I mean, I think could be potential. If I just address the point on master planning, I guess I made when I spoke, it's you know, having worked for Grosvenor for a long period of time, I've had a small role to play in a number of master plans, be that Liverpool one or the recent scheme in Bermondsey that Grosvenor are promoting in South East London. And you know, I think master planning has a really important role to play, and you know, a company like Elysian would be very keen to participate in the right master plans. The point I'm making is that often it's just an afterthought to stick in a master plan, you know, some form of specialist housing for older people without due consideration to timing, when in a, say, 1,000 home master plan, the you know, housing for older people will come forward, because older people are much more sensitive about being pioneers and being surrounded by development around them than potentially younger people. And I think, you know, secondly, it's to think about the location within that master plan, just to how does it help support the use. So thoughtful and, you know, early planning with people who are actually going to operate these communities, I think is helpful. Where it's just a numbers game and it's stuck in a master plan, as I said, as an afterthought, which I have seen happen, you know, in practice on a number of occasions is less helpful. So yeah, a specialist use class could help us, but there are other tools as well available too that could help see greater delivery of this housing type.
The thing I used to find when I was chief planner is that there was a virtual queue around the corner of people who wanted changes to use class. I mean, there's always an ask for, you know, can we pray particular needs for a particular use class, whether it be certain types of retail or certain types of residential. I mean, the C class could have sort of 10 different categories on it if you embrace this, but that doesn't mean to say that it wouldn't actually help people who are wanting to deliver. Anne-Marie, I mean, do you think that's worth us banging the drum for?
I do. I think we're so far behind in where we are compared to other countries. We've got such a crisis on our hands. It even says that in the planning practice guidance. Well, it doesn't say crisis, it's critical. So anything to actually incentivize or facilitate or to tell people that this needs to be included. And I completely second what Marcus said about master plans. And I was remembering fondly the comments that came from Tony Pidgley after an APPG about housing for older people. You know, one of these, what are the barriers? He said, do you remember when they used to make us do this? And he was referring to the sort of, you know, the HCA and the grants that were available. And I think it was the reason why Kidbrooke came about. He said, when they told us what to do, it was a fairer setting. We need that back. Because I think he was talking about the house builders across the board. Rather than having a sense of duty, they had a sense that, well, this was everybody would have to provide. So therefore, it's a level playing field. And I think then you'd get people focusing, as they do in their master planning, some very skillful people thinking about the interaction of communities and how we all live and what choice needs to be available. And we've seen in the chat, you know, obviously one size does not fit all. There are different communities, different economic settings, different demographics. And I also remember another large developer telling me that they'd moved away from just focusing on the single demographic of the younger household and then targeting all the leisure and the retail at that demographic. So it will follow. I think if you have something, you know, I mean, I said earlier, you don't need to be told. You can actually, as a local authority, make those decisions, but some don't, and some do and some don't. So I think we'll have a better outcome if we're pushed more.
Yeah. So what I suppose you're pressing for there is a bit of a stick and carrot, sort of a little bit more direction, but to encourage people to embrace it more. It is the case, and certainly from my own experience and looking at the delivery of planning when I was chief planner. Often it wasn't what the regulations said, what was in the guidance, what was in the NPPF. It fell to how that was being interpreted and delivered at the local level. And that's very frustrating from a central government point of view, because you can't sit on the shoulder of every local planning authority and say, well, this is what you're supposed to do, this is what this means. And so it's quite frustrating. Having said that, this is a real challenge for us. I don't think we should sit and just wait for the crisis to occur. So really keen to try and see what needs to be done to try and help deliver. Do you think the white paper in sort of moving to the three sorts of zones, I said to Zedward, I was trying to avoid the Zedward, 3 areas allocated for growth, renewal and protection, is that going to help, or is that going to mean that actually it's going to make it more difficult for local authorities to sort of allocate sort of areas for particular types of uses? You've got a growth area. Is this something that worries you? Mark, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy touched upon it, that, you know, the policy is to be drafted. So I think, you know, first observation is the white paper is very light on detail and information. And, you know, I think, as I said earlier, the devil's always in the detail. You know, that said, I think as currently drafted, if there wasn't recognition of the need for housing for older people, I think it would make it equally, if not more difficult for housing for older people to come forward. And I believe that's the case, coming back to sort of my observation on, you know, economics compared to traditional house building, which is, you know, we can't compete with house builder is if there isn't some recognition that we provide additional benefits over that which traditional housing brings. And this isn't to say, you know, I've got greatest respect for house builders and the importance of building homes, you know, across the country. And, you know, similarly, affordable housing has a very important role to play. All I'm saying is on economics is it's not a level playing field of somebody like Elysium competing against a house builder if, you know, viability, etc., is treated in the same manner. So, you know, that's my concern, which is, you know, zone for growth could be really positive in the right location. But, you know, one would probably see that all going to, you know, market housing rather than our use type, unless there's some kind of intervention to try and level up the playing field.
Okay, I mean, maybe Jeremy, you have a view on some of the fiscal, broader financial issues here. I mean, we talked about, you know, why would somebody move, and I've talked broadly about whether there should be more, I don't know, tax incentives, and if people free up capital from their house, should they be able to pass it on to their children more readily without having to live for 7 years before they get taxed on it. Are these issues which are preventing the market responding to what should be a demand, or am I sort of digging where I don't need to dig? Jeremy,
No, I think put the fork in. So I think the issue here is, I said, you know, what are these incentives? You know, so things like stamp duty, help to move packages, how we can encourage and enable people to think about resizing, right sizing is really important, because I think that, as I sort of hinted at my presentation, it's on the one hand, it's about the demand, but also it's about making sure we got both the quality and we're tackling inequalities in our housing system. And those inequalities can't just be addressed by planning and land. It's also to think about what the revenue will be in terms of making those schemes viable, both in terms of the service charges, but also the types of care and support that's going in. So those fiscal measures that you refer to, I think need to be seen in a whole system way. And perhaps one of the difficulties we've had in our planning, and perhaps even some of the recent cases, is they're very narrow-minded because they're very much focused on looking at those particular plots. But, you know, I really think that longer term, and Andy mentioned inclusion, we need to think about how we're both designing for inclusion, but planning for inclusion. And there's a fundamental Qualities Act. The Qualities Act, you know, we really need to think longer term, not just about the stewardship of the land for the next 5-10 years, but for the next 50 years if we're really going to address ageing population. And in the chat box, just to say, there's been some really interesting conversations about the retrofitting of city centres and urban areas using redundant office spaces. I think these are prime examples where we can think creatively to think how much of that will be part of a future silver city, for the want of a term.
Interesting then that again, picking up Mark's point about you know, competing in a market, people I think the phrase that the government's using about repurposing buildings in particular in city centres. I mean, Andy, is this something that you think is part of the work you've seen, both in terms of the white paper and also the changes to permitted development rights? Is this something you think the government is sort of open to?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to encourage clearly a more flexible situation where other uses can be introduced, particularly high streets and town centres, and that entirely suits the needs, or the sort of the needs of the occupiers of housing for older people, in the sense of easier access to facilities on the doorstep, better transport, a whole series of sort of beneficial aspects to repurposing city centres. In terms of permitted development rights, it's very difficult to talk about that because there's a legal case going on at the moment, as you know, which makes it difficult to sort of express a view from a government perspective. But fundamentally, the ability to change the use of buildings a lot easier is part of, well, in a sense, is part of the change in which society, in which the economics of society are working now, that we have to actually look at a more flexible sort of approach to the buildings. In terms of the white paper, I just wanted to sort of emphasize the issue around the importance of design coding and how design coding might actually work in the future. Because I think there is a sort of an expectation that local plans will be much reduced, will be visual, will be more three-dimensional, will be able to be consulted on much earlier in the process. There's a lot of good stuff in there in terms of how you might engage with communities much earlier. And part of the engagement, of course, is actually making sure that places are designed to accommodate the uses that are needed in that place. So I think the community engagement piece for design codes is really critical to really help define the kind of uses that are needed locally. And master planning, you know, picking up Mark's point and Anne-Marie's point, master planning at the earliest stage to integrate the different uses, including housing for older people, is a real opportunity. So I think moving towards a more visual local plan-led system, which defines uses, actually specifies how buildings fit together, and either done by the local authority or by the private sector. There isn't sort of at the moment an emphasis on that, but you will have heard the appointment of a chair of a steering group that's looking at a design body that will help to shape some of this design coding work for local authorities. So I think, you know, best not to sort of just think about the current system, the current use class system. Think also about, you know, what's coming around the corner and how you might help shape that. There's a real opportunity now, so get your consultations in, make sure that you are expressing, you know, clearly the challenges this sector is facing.
Yeah, that's a good advice, Andy, and I hope that the design codes is more than about aesthetics and about how places work and operate. The time presses, and I just wanted to sort of reflect on the fact that we've talked about being more directive in terms of policy, but also the economics and the financial issues that need to go to it. I think, Andy, you said you were in listening mode earlier. I think those are two big issues that I think you should take away from this discussion. I think they should go hand in hand. If you're going to see repurposing of buildings, then I think you're going to need to have some financial incentives to give people an opportunity to do so. One thing I want to just do finally go around the panel very quickly and just talk about the language we use. I mean, we talked about this being about retirement and supported living. We've talked about living later life, an aging population. I mean, is there a view that we need a common standard to rally around, or is this a reflection of the complexity of what we're trying to plan for? And Anne-Marie, I'm going to start with you and then sort of quickly go around the department, the panel, because we're very quickly running out of time.
Okay, well, I think we need to separate this between a sort of a planning or a use class definition and how this is marketed or understood by the people who are either trying to attract a customer or sell to a customer or explain or identify to a local authority, you know, adult social care. So I think we're sort of a bit stuck with extra care in the planning system. It's been referenced in so many documents now, and I don't think it's a bad thing. And I think we should leave the market to define their own product, but definitely something else.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Mark?
You saw me, we haven't rehearsed this, but I was vehemently nodding that I think that's the right explanation, I think, from Anne-Marie. I think, you know, the need for understanding sort of customers' process in understanding what they're buying, etc., is very different from a planning discussion, and one needs to separate the two.
Thank you, Mark. Jerry?
Yeah, interesting debate. I think we need a better language. A ULI report that came out last year sort of looked at some of the barriers for moving, and some of that was the language. And we're working with Ipsos Mori and a couple of others to develop a questionnaire so that we can approach older people, but also people in early life, so 40 and 50-year-olds as well, to think about what their concepts are, because they clearly don't want the care word.
Thank you very much. And Andy, you said you were in listening mode. Have you heard things that you can take away?
I mean, I think definitely. I mean, I'd urge Kratos and the group here to actually put together a paper and submit it and you get this down on in writing, so that there's some definite propositions coming forward. In terms of language, I'm 65, I'm young. So, I mean, I don't want to feel that I'm being categorized in some sort of way. And I think a lot of older people feel like that. You know, they want to stay mobile, active as long as they possibly can, and well into 70s and 80s.
Thank you, Andy. And I said at the very beginning, I resemble that remark. So it's something which I think we're all familiar with. Can I thank all the panelists for their contribution today, and say to the people that have been listening to the debate, and thank you for those people that have been giving questions. I do feel this is something that is not a one-off. This is a beginning of a discussion, and I think we may well take up your invitation, Andy, to try and do more on this and to actually try and focus on how this can actually be taken forward. It's a really important issue. It's something which I feel, and the mood of the discussion was that the planning authorities have tried to address, but they don't do it in a holistic or a way which makes it a central part of their thinking. And I think that we need to try and champion for a change in that direction. Can I thank all the panelists, thank all the people for listening, and let's see if we can have another one of these sessions in a few months' time and see whether we can actually see what our paper has said and what the government has responded. And by then, Andy, your competition might be out, so we can have a look at that too. Thank you all very much, and I should say a farewell to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.